very cold morning where we appear to be almost snowed in again. Welcome to my video blog, Rants and Raves. This episode is called Ruling Class Crisis, the fourth in a series. And in this episode, I think I would like to recap and introduce some questions before I go on developing this thesis. Now, to recap, all complex societies have a ruling class. That's just a fact of life, and it's unavoidable. A ruling class is the class that specializes in three things: arms, land, originally, these days read production, and knowledge. We are, I believe, in the middle of what I call a ruling class crisis, which is a widespread realization in society, consciously or unconsciously, that we have a ruling class that is not fit to rule. They don't fight. They're far less involved in production than ruling classes have been. They're more involved in influence peddling, financial manipulation, and when they do have anything to do with it, tends to be in the intangibles, a few degrees removed from the actual physical production of goods. Now, I pointed out that a ruling class can be stable if, well, one, if it fulfills its functions, arms, land, knowledge. It is open enough to the ambitious, i.e. that however tight it is, it is still cheaper and easier to try to join the ruling class than it is to overthrow it. And three, that it loves, or at the very least identifies its self-interest with the nation. Now, I pointed out that there are hierarchies within the ruling class, and you could look historically through lots of examples. The one I like, probably because it's so obscure to everybody else, is the Polish division of the ruling class into szlachetny and półszlachetny, which is noble and half noble. They use that the same terms for precious and semi-precious stones in the Polish language, by the way. And we have come up with something rather odd these days. It appears that a ruling class can be too open, resulting in what has been called an overproduction of elites. And that for the last generation and more, entry into the ruling class was promised for the extremely cheap price of one getting a college degree and holding all of the correct opinions within a very, very narrow range of permissible disagreement. Now, this membership obviously has not transferred into wealth. We know a lot of people, of course. The scandal of higher education is that people assume a debt they'll be paying off the rest of their lives. They'll be deferring having children, and very few of them have seen, or fewer and fewer, I should say, have seen their efforts coming to naught. So have seen their efforts coming into fruition, and they are reacting with rage. The rage is expressed in any number of ways, among them an attempt to rule. And some of these, as I said, because there's an overproduction of rulers, what do? Well, they occupy themselves with being the most intolerable busybodies you can imagine, and one of them, within their own circles, of course, is the ultimate in humiliation, is to make people pay lip service to ideas of breathtaking absurdity, which looks rather like the old Soviet Union, which was an example I cited as independent confirmation of a ruling class becoming too large. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, party membership was something like 25%. In modern China, it's 7%. Looking back in history, Poland, when it was in a state of what one historian called anarchy tempered by civil war, the ruling class was an astonishing 15% of society, whereas in your average European country, the nobility was about 5%. Now, going on from there, some observations. Traditionally, ruling classes have been very well aware of the spoiling effects of growing up with wealth and power, and they have socializing mechanisms to counter this, which they are also aware work imperfectly. These mechanisms include things like tough schools. Think of the English prep school thing, rites of passage, etc. If you were fond of something like 300 or some of the historical dramas about the Greek and Persian wars, remember that the Persian monarchs, though absolute, were not effeminate cowards. A prince of Persia had to pass through a test in which he was put in an arena with a lion and a spear. Said, go kill that lion and then you can have your power. Some of the Ottoman heirs, I believe, I don't know if they required or it was just suggested, but they learned trades. I think there was a sultan who was a fairly competent watchmaker, another was a gardener and such. And you have, in societies which practice strict primogeniture and entail, such as England, our mother country, where entail meaning when estates are passed on intact, as in legally, you were not allowed to divide them by law. Thomas Jefferson considered one of the proudest accomplishments was abolishing the Virginia law on entail, which he thought would prevent an aristocracy from growing up. Is, of course, if you have more than one heir, you have more than one heir, you have some in line there. If your immediate heir turns out to be a wastrel, well, perhaps he might have a steeplechase accident and break his neck, and then a younger son might take over. Who knows? And upward flow from the bottom. Ruling classes, even fairly strict high-living aristocracies, such as the European nobility, particularly the British nobility. When you look closely, you find there actually is a surprising amount of upward flow into there, and this is, first of all, well, by marriage, and this occurs in any number of societies in which you can kind of shuffle the daughters aside. In Europe, it could be done humanely by, if you could afford to marry them off, you'd marry them off, and then you want your sons to marry someone who might be the daughter of somebody really, really wealthy who would come with a big fat dowry, and everybody would pretend, that she was far better born than she was. In some societies, in some of the Hindu jats and castes, they simply killed their baby girls. They killed their baby girls, and from lower castes, rising wealth in lower castes. Again, the point about how easy it is to get into the ruling class rather than overthrow it. They would marry their daughters into the upper castes with, again, large dowries, resulting in a flow of wealth and treasure upwards. It was done more humanely in Europe, I think. Sometimes you might shuffle a daughter or two into a convent or something. When England turned Protestant, that was no longer an option. So, but as I say, there's an upward flow. There was a documentary I saw once in which from the early 1800s and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution up until the end of that century, there was a fellow who started out as a mill worker who became a mill owner and lived to see his grandson in the House of Lords. So England, their aristocracy, in fact, started allowing males to rise in there. Now, I would also recommend Downton Abbey, and a friend of mine, yes, I mean you, Mark, introduced me to Downton Abbey last year, I think, and I binge watched it all summer. There is a perfect example of this. If you watched through the whole series, You see the changes. You see a family that is in fact adapting to changes in the world, and you see people rising and joining. In fact, there's a fellow who starts out as a fenian and a chauffeur, and marries into the family. Now, again, as I said, we're in what I call a ruling class crisis. Now, and I've shown the ruling class is not fit to rule. Now, usually what happens in cases like that is they sort of die off or get shuffled to the side, or they lose their fortunes and their positions. Some years back, I saw something about the title that Lord Nelson won at Trafalgar. Lord Nelson of Trafalgar had been inherited by the last guy in the family line, who turned out to be a sergeant in the police force. So, and it came with no money, just a title, and he could of course sit in the House of Lords, but this is what I see now, and I'm going to throw this out here. The problem is now, as I say, the lower ranks of the ruling class tend to rise as the upper becomes degenerate, for want of a better word. The problem today is the lower ranks, the people I referred to as the people who were promised a position in the ruling class, a meritocratic position for getting, allegedly meritocratic, I should say, for the price of getting a college degree and having all the right opinions, are no more fit to rule. In fact, probably less fit to rule than the people who already occupy those positions. The ruling class is still, at the very top levels, full of people who know how to do things. That is, however, slipping. I mean, this could persist for another generation, perhaps, something, but they're not really raising heirs, is my strong impression, and they're not recruiting worthy heirs either. They don't serve. In fact, they despise the profession of arms. I have been told by veterans and others that veterans are not really welcome in the boardroom anymore. It used to be that in boardrooms you would find loads of retired colonels and generals and such. I've been exposed to the ruling class in a couple of different ways. One is I attended an academy for a short time. Another is that I used to work in a fancy restaurant, and I was a bartender, for a maitre d' and then a bartender there. And I do remember a colonel who I think sat on the board of one of the oil companies. He used to come in, and it turned out that in Vietnam he had been something called a petroleum procurement officer, and he used to talk to Lyndon Johnson by closed-circuit TV once a week. And he told me that, listen, I didn't know what the hell was going on 25 miles outside of Saigon, so, I'm sure those kids there didn't know either. And he thought they were justly concerned about being thrown into it. I don't think you find very many people like him in boardrooms anymore. And as I've said, I've heard there's an active hostility towards veterans in the upper ranks of the corporate world. They have no practical skills, knowledge of the production of tangible goods. And this creates a cognitive disconnect with the reality of civilization's infrastructure and maintenance, both physical and cultural, as I pointed out in my last video on the return of the primitive. They don't know what it takes to operate a civilization and to maintain it. As a result, we're getting these bizarre plans to do something like the green initiative that's been proposed recently and such. I mean, anybody who knows anything about engineering, not anybody who knows what the bleeding melting point of steel is, anybody who has a concept of numbers, at least orders of magnitude, who know come on, one, it's not going to work, and two, you could wreck our infrastructure by trying to make it work. There are people who are proposing these things and actually intend to put them into practice. Like, we're all going to put solar panels on our roof and run our civilization off the energy generated by windmills or something. And as I pointed out in my last video, hominem unius tabula timeo, that they see the world through a single map. There's a one-size-fits-all model they think explains everything. It said, hey, why do you disagree with me? Oh, it's simple. It's because you're a racist. Okay, yep. Why is there a high crime rate in the inner cities? Oh, because they're oppressed. This makes them mentally rigid, maladaptive, and unable to change and adapt to circumstances. It gets to the point it's hard to talk to them. You're not speaking the same. Not only are you not on the same page, it's like you're not on the same perceptual reality with these people. And fourthly, they actively loathe the civilization that supports them and allows them to survive with that kind of cognitive disconnect. So, who's going to replace the ruling class as it ages and decays? I don't know. I absolutely don't know. It's very hard to see where, usually there's a rising mercantile class or something of that sort. I don't know, and I don't know where it will come from. Is it going to come from red state, rural America? I don't know. Yeah, there is what we've noticed, what we call the great sort. There's a certain sort of people who are moving to the less populated areas, and by rural we don't mean like Hicksville and going onto the farm and raising organic vegetables. We mean that to date the best, really only thing we've found that explains voting patterns in this country is population density. The people who fancy themselves the elites and the people who vote with them and such are concentrated in the high population density areas of the southern west coast and the east coast down, and in the state capitals and major cities. In my state, Minnesota, is technically a blue state, but if you look at the electoral map, you'll see it's red except in patches around the Twin Cities and in St. Cloud and over up near Fargo-Moorhead, like that. The rest is red clear through. Of course, the people in those cities outnumber the people elsewhere. The people in the less populated areas are very well aware of this, that they're being outnumbered and outvoted by people in some very high population density areas who generally don't like them, in fact rather despise them. Oh God, I could tell you about a friend who periodically makes, although he came from a fairly small town, periodically makes remarks about people in other parts of the country, like the South and Texas, the rural areas there, like that, that are extremely bigoted, and got very, very offended with me when I told him he was a bigot. So here we are. I'll have more to say about this crisis, but this is the point I wanted to make. I wanted to recap, and I wanted to point out that, so where is the replacement coming from? We don't know. We simply don't know. What that means, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll figure it out as we go further into this thesis, and maybe not. Good morning. Good morning on this frosty morning. I'm Steve Brown. This is Rants and Raves. Have a nice day.